Good morning or afternoon from wherever you are. On behalf of the NMC, I'm delighted to welcome you to the NMC Beyond the Horizon Digital Humanities Today. I'm your host today, Alex Freeman. I'm the Senior Director of Membership and Special Projects at the NMC. I'm joined by the NMC's Annie Davis, Michelle Cummins, and Gordon Jackson. This complimentary offering of the NMC Beyond the Horizon is a feature of our NMC membership. Don't miss the nearly 20 online events we are planning in 2018 by becoming a member of the NMC today. So I'll go ahead and drop a link in there. About today's topic, the field of digital humanities, which refers to a suite of digital and computational tools currently being used to advance digital scholarship in the humanities, is changing the way educators work. For example, digital humanities, or DH for short, enables the analysis of data in ways that were not possible without new technologies, including visualizing or manipulating texts to reveal patterns, the display of complex histories through interactive maps, and the creation of 3D models to aid in the recreation of historical sites and artifacts. In this session today, please use the Q&A box for comments or questions that you have for the panel. And if you're on Twitter, that's great. So are we. We have over 18,000 followers, and our hashtag for today's event is hashtag NMCHZ, also referred to as waffle fries NM cheese by one of our past staffers. We have also created a Slack channel, which is something new for this program. So we hope that those of you that want to continue the conversation or have some other resources to share, take advantage of that Slack channel. We have somebody who's going to be monitoring that and bringing some of those thoughts into this discussion today. For this problem, if you would like to share resources or continue the conversation, do that in the Slack channel. In this 1-hour event, we will hear from 4 digital humanities thought leaders as they'll discuss digital humanities in today's higher education environment. Now, on to just to give a brief overview of who we have today. Our moderator is AJ Kelton from Montclair State University. We have Dina Gregor from Washington State University and the Electronic Literature Organization. We have Adam Rzetka from Montclair State University as well, and Ethan Waltrall from Michigan State University. So I want to give it over to AJ at this point. Before I do, I'm going to launch a poll so that we can get a sense of how much you know about this topic today. So let me go ahead and launch that while we get started here.
Alex, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. We're very excited. This has been in the planning for quite some time. Both organizations, Emerging Learning Design and the New Media Consortium, spent some time this spring and culminating in our summer events, our conference and the NMC Summer Conference, had discussions around the digital humanities, and NMC and ELD have worked together for a few years now. And we decided that we wanted to take the discussion to the next level. And so that's what prompted today's webinar. And we're hoping to be able to continue the momentum in the spring, potentially with something else for us to focus on. I'd like to encourage everybody to go ahead and take part in that poll. If you're in the Slack channel, please feel free. There are a couple of channels in there that you can participate in, and Kyla is there moderating that for us. It also, and I'll add this in here afterwards as part of my introduction, like to just remind you or to tell you folks that both ELD, which is the Emerging Learning Design, and its companion journal, the Emerging Learning Design Journal, currently have calls open. ELD has its call open for its conference that will be taking place in June. And the Emerging Learning Design Journal is doing a special issue on learner experience. I'll post the links in there, and I won't do any more any gratuitous self-promotion on this. So a little bit about myself before we get to the really interesting folks here. I'm really looking forward to you getting to meet and hear from our panelists. They're amazing. But as I said, my name's AJ Kelton. I am at Montclair State University. I've been here for 18 years and recently founded and am directing our brand new Center for the Digital Humanities. I didn't realize I was a digital humanist for many years, but I was, and I didn't know that that's what it was called. And so when I discovered the digital humanities a short time ago, compared to some of the folks you're going to talk to, I felt like I found my tribe. it felt really great. And so I'm very excited for you to get to meet some of the other people that are part of the tribe here. So I'm going to start with Dina and let them introduce themselves and tell you just a little bit about who they are, where they are, what they do, and just a brief example of what some of the work is that they're doing. And emphasis on the word brief.
I'm Dina Gregor, and I am the director and also professor of creative media and digital culture at Washington State University, Vancouver. And that's the Vancouver that's close to Portland, not the Canadian Vancouver. I've been working in the field of what's now called digital humanities for a long time, but we called it many other names. Everything from humanities computing to humanistic computing, a variety of terms, and now it's settled in the DH. My specific area of interest is the curation, creation, and preservation and criticism of a form of born digital media called electronic literature, or what we call eLit. And this is, it began as hypertext literature, hypertext fiction, poetry, became flash fiction when the web became popularized with the browser. And now you see it in things like literary games. If you've ever played Stanley Parable, we consider that a form of electronic literature. My strength right now, what I've been doing for the past 5 years, is that I've built a lab of 60 Macintoshes and a few PCs, and I'm at the process of preserving the pre-web works that were so instrumental from the late 80s to the early 90s. And what we're doing is I've got like a collection of 300 works in my library of these kinds of literary works. And they're on 3.5-inch floppies and 5.25-inch floppies and CDs. And this is all dead tech, essentially. And so what I'm doing is I'm able to use the computers, these vintage computers dating back to '77, and actually experience the works in their original format, in the original hardware. While I'm doing that, I'm writing about it, taking pictures, documenting it, and putting it into books and multimedia books in Scalar platform so that other people can access it and experience it. And I'm doing this before they're all gone. I figure we've got a good 10 to 15 years before all of this technology is completely bit rotted and gone. So I'm working as fast as I can in my lab. And the lab's called the Electronic Literature Lab. I'm doing everything from live traversal so that people can get this information out quickly, as well as publishing this in the Scalar and criticism in regular print-based books. That's essentially what I'm doing. I'm also president of the Electronic Literature Organization. So that's my area.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to you. And I encourage you to post some of the URLs to some of that resource material into the document we've shared, and I'll make sure that everybody gets access to that either during or after today's session. So I'd like to turn it over to Adam now. Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Am I audible, AJ? Great, just checking. So I'm an English professor here at Montclair State and on the faculty advisory committee for our fairly brand new Center for Digital Humanities here at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Montclair State. That's the center that AJ is heading up. I've also been involved here last year in helping to craft a digital humanities master's degree for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And then I'd say, aside from just lots of various uses of the digital humanities in my own work and in the classroom, I've been involved with the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and their incredible superhuman efforts to digitize a number of early modern plays, hundreds of early modern plays. And I've been working with them a little bit over the past couple summers to figure out primarily what to do with these intensively coded, digitized versions of these early modern texts in the classroom. So what are the pedagogical uses of something that's that heavily kind of edited in a digital sense, curated in a digital sense, and then also to do some thinking about what kind of research is emerging or might emerge from that kind of work with texts. So I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Adam. And last but by far least, Ethan, please tell us about yourself.
Sure. I'm Ethan Wottrell. I'm faculty in the Department of Anthropology at Michigan State University. I'm also Associate Director of Matrix, the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences. And sort of thirdly, I'm Director of the Cultural Heritage Informatics Initiative. I'm an archaeologist by trade and training. I spent years and years working in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. And my work now is primarily digital. I don't have an active field program. I'm primarily, my own research and my own work is focused on sort of publicly engaged digital heritage and archaeology. And that includes, I'm particularly interested in mobile stuff, but also augmented reality and 3D and web mapping and anything that is publicly engaged. Certainly also interested in sort of preservation stuff. I have a whole number of projects. I mean, as an admin of a center, there's always lots of projects going on. We're 23 years old. We've been around for 23 years. We fall on the cultural heritage side of things, specifically engaging with history and anthropology. But I have 5 grants right now I'm PI or co-PI of, including the Archive of Malian Photography, the Institute for Digital Archaeological Method and Practice, What America Ate, ARCS, the Archaeological Resource Cataloging System, and then another additional Mellon grant. All those other ones are NEH grants. So I basically spend the vast majority of my time writing grants.
I need to take a master class from you, Ethan.
I don't know.
Need to get good at that. So, I mean, I think the one thing that we've seen pretty clearly is the diversity of the different types of projects, and from some of the pre-conversation, that's really one of the things that folks are really interested in. You know, one of my thoughts was that, you know, people might come to this and want to know what the definition is of the digital humanities, and you know, it's just it's far from time to have that conversation, right? We're really talking about, like, so what are we doing with the digital humanities now? And what surprised me most when I started to learn more about where the digital humanities came from is that it isn't just a buzzword in the last 10 years. This is something that's been going on for quite some time, since the 40s and 50s in Europe, and then it made its way over here and actually started out of the computer science department and humanizing computers. You know, so anyway, it's a very interesting history. So I'm not gonna what I'd like to do is I would like to get right to some of the things that I think are fundamentally important as far as what I've been hearing from other folks and what I think I want to hear. So what I'd like each of you to do, either in turn or not, but let's talk about how digital humanities projects have fundamentally changed what we know and how we come to know that. Has there been a change in methodology? What counts as results? What counts as knowledge? So I'll just open that up, or I'll call on one of you.
I mean, I'm particularly, I mean, given my bent and my own interest, I think sort of the most impactful aspect of this space has been broadening access to, in my case, you know, cultural heritage materials, and that's access to lots of different publics, whether it is the scholarly public, whether it is students, or whether it is dissent communities, providing access, preserving and providing access to cultural heritage that might not necessarily have been previously accessible by those populations, or quite frankly at all. That's the thing that I see as one of the most important aspects of this space, and the change that it has wrought on the academy, sort of, you know, and scholarship writ large.
For me, I mean, I like to think that it changed the way I thought about my relationship with the work I do and with the objects I work with. And I think my difference of how I work with somebody who might be a fine art person who uses computers, what makes me a DH person and them not one, is not the fact we both are using computers, but for me, it's the computer is a medium in which I work. It's not a tool. It's not a tool for me. It's exactly the medium where I work. Whereas my friend who's a fine artist uses Photoshop and Lightroom to enhance his photographs. that's a totally different approach. And when I made that shift intellectually, it changed the way I worked with everything I did. So whether I was making something book-like for print, I recognized the differences, the constraints and affordances of that environment, and how that was, how that differed so widely from the computer-based environments I was working. Lastly, I'll say that I got onto this because I was using computers to translate Homer when I was working on my PhD, and I realized I was doing these word searches with my fingers in a text, and it would take me months to do it. And with the tool that was available, just newly available, Pandora and Perseus, I did that same search in 15 minutes. So what began as a process of, I can do this faster and better, it now has become this, it's a different animal altogether. It's a different way of structuring my life.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think Ethan and Dini have set up kind of a couple stages of what I think of as a spectrum here, starting with access, which I really agree with Ethan. I don't think there's are very many other aspects of the digital humanities that compare in terms of impact with increased access. But access to, let's say, materials, to other people's research, to creative works, to political and expressive works on the one hand. Then for Dini, the change in media, the change in the medium. So we're moving sort of from access to other work to the medium in which that access happens, and to some extent the medium in which that thinking or that encounter happens. And I'd just say, to round out the other end of the spectrum, that I think there is a significant, if not the most important, impact on expression and on research. And I think this is where we get into some tricky territory. That is to say, the way AJ has set up the question, do the digital humanities change our methodologies? I think that's a crucial question. And I think that if we're talking about the way that digital humanities may or may not alter research, including, at least at my university, I think most universities where research here can include creative expression and artistic expression as well. Do they change output, the nature of the output? So the nature of the method used and the nature of the output in some substantial way, right? So if I write a journal article, on my computer, as we all do, as opposed to a typewriter, I wouldn't necessarily say that substantially changes the method. But there are lots of other examples that I think do. So yeah, and I like Dini's point too, that we don't necessarily have to think of these as tools so much as media in which we're working. But I think there is something also to be said in some cases for thinking of whether or not the tools fundamentally alter the nature of the methods we use and the results we get.
So Caroline Crawford is watching along, and she's asked to talk a little bit more about the faster and better commentary with concern to impact on increased access. Her full comment is, she says that research efforts and spider web connections make it able to locate more viable resources. Did you want to comment on that?
Well, from my standpoint, it was a matter of having more time to do the textual analysis rather than just do a search with my fingers across a text and find certain words I was looking for, terminologies. I was calling them descriptors. It took me 6 months to do that project by hand. And that was 6 months I could have used to think about what I was doing. So I think my response to that is, it's not that it does it better, but having that access to make this work, the work that's kind of mundane, become less onerous and be able to spend more time thinking about that text. That's what that did for me. And then when I wrote the work, when I was writing the article, I wrote it as a hypertext. So I didn't write it as necessarily as a print-based work originally. It became a hypertextual work because I felt like that was the process by which I was doing all this inspection of the text. So.
Yeah, and I'm also very interested, as an English person, in whether or not these tools, and I think it's actually a complicated question what the relationship between a tool and a medium is. I think there are lots of ways in which a tool is inseparable from the medium. I'm referring back to the Grau quote that Caroline put in chat here. A computer is not a tool or prosthesis, it is the medium in which we work. I think that those two overlap a lot, but I'm interested in whether that tool or that medium changes the nature of close reading, which is, I think, what a version of which Dini is describing here. So, in the Folger workshop we were doing a couple summers ago, late in the game, we reached this slight point of absurdity where we were looking at a relatively short poem, a poem of like 20 or 25 lines, and this poem had been thoroughly coded, right, to identify every instance of, gendered pronouns, every instance of references to Greek mythology, and, someone was saying, well, now look, we can just kind of search instantly and find every reference you can find every gendered pronoun in this poem. But because the poem's only 25 lines, right, we can do this with our mind, brains, and eyes faster, without having encoded it first. So I think that there, again, is a wide range of questions about how useful these tools are. And for me, really, whether they fundamentally alter the practice and the conclusions we draw from close reading. So that's very interesting to me. But again, I think like the tool to some extent is the medium, and the medium is the tool. And again, my sort of guiding question is whether they fundamentally and substantially alter method.
I mean, for me, I'd say, what constitutes better, right? I mean, it's like that is certainly, a contextual statement. Certainly you can ask and answer different questions that you might not necessarily have been able to ask, and certainly in sort of the space that I use. But one, are those questions better, and are the results better?
Well, in the case of what I did is that I was looking for descriptions that connected Penelope, Telemachus, Odysseus, and Athena, and setting them apart from the rest of the characters in the Homer's Odyssey. And that's a very big task to undertake. And I was a graduate student at the time, and I was just learning the Greek. What I learned in doing this work is that, and it came almost like a loom itself, and I was weaving this information together. So when I did the hypertextual model, where I was linking these words together, I came up with something that I didn't see when I was doing the old-fashioned read every line, try to pull it out and write it down on paper. It did change the way I saw the text. And because of that, I couldn't write an essay that was a traditional essay. I had to turn it into the hypertext first and publish that essentially. Then I began to think about, okay, what can I tease out of this that, traditional scholars might find interesting? So for me, it was a process. I mean, and that's the other thing I think that's interesting is that for us in DH, the process is important, but so is the end product. Whereas if you're trained in Ret Comp, process is so important. By the time you get to the fifth draft of your paper, it's easy to, you're kind of done with it. But for us, if we don't code that web page right, if we don't code the system correctly, we're not going to get an end product. So the process and the product they go hand in hand. They're both very important.
So I want to pick up on something that's come up a couple of times here. Actually, Dina, you were talking about hypertext, and it's been years since I've heard anybody use that phrase. Just because it was historically, we've been talking about hypertext and markup for a very long time. And you also used the phrase traditional scholar. And I think that brings up an important point in that what is scholarship, right? Where are we with scholarship? But more importantly, does DH have a longer historical narrative? And so I wanted to sort of talk about that a little bit
Yep.
So then the question becomes, how can we position the digital humanities in the longer historical narrative?
I think I can start in there since I think I posed that question. I think that too often we're seeing the digital humanities as this kind of, in this very localized narrative of progress, which is the way we tend to see all advances in technology. But of course, it's part of a very long history of the manipulation of information, the encoding of information, the reading of information. So I'm very interested in the history of the book and history of reading. And I see the digital humanities as fitting in many fields directly into that history. And then I'd also just add something that we sort of like both celebrate and criticize in the digital humanities pretty often, which is the visual representation of data, visualization, right? Where that also has a very long history. And some of the work that I've done in the Renaissance, is about the arts of memory, for instance, which are effectively ways of visually representing and thereby encoding information, right, as opposed to reading it. or summarizing information in previous work. So I really do see this as a phase in the history of information, and I think that often we can benefit by situating it in that history.
Well, I'm here right now at Triangle SEI that's being hosted at the Rizzo Center by the Triangle universities here, and it's a Mellon-funded event, and it lasts about a week. And what we are doing this time, the theme is digital storytelling, and we're looking at digital storytelling as ways to talk about scholarly, work, and how we can reach a public that's not just scholars, and broaden our horizons. And so the folks that are here are primarily DH people. There's some folks that aren't, but primarily that's what we are. And we're interested in ways of taking the things that we know how to do and sharing that with folks that don't necessarily do multimedia, multimodal, visual, gestural kinds of things, works, and help them with that, because we see this way of doing things as very much what our students are interested in. They're coming up the ranks with these skill sets, and we need to harness them and help them understand what they're doing. So it's a little bit of digital literacy standpoint, but also using what these students know to transform education. So that's what we're doing here this week, and we're finishing up tomorrow afternoon. It's been a very interesting experience. So
one of the interesting things when the inevitable question of sort of the historicity of this space and the kind of historical narrative in it is that oftentimes sort of scholars who are talking about this are talking about their discipline's specific historical narrative. And all of these, right, because this is an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary space, it's important to sort of recognize the fact that all scholars who come to inhabit this space bring their own historical narrative that is unique to that discipline and that discipline's engagement with the computational or later sort of the digital. So, right, of course, the often well-trodden, justly so, narrative within the literary studies is Roberta Busa, but that is purely mostly within that discipline, where history brings something different. My discipline brings something different, and while these are similar, certainly, and also how they play out within that discipline, they each bring something different to this sort of shared space that we all inhabit. So recognizing that is personally I think is fundamentally important to understanding that historical trajectory.
Can I mention something? One of my colleagues, Will Lors, is a cinema expert, and he teaches our cinema narrative courses and video courses, but also our coding courses. But he was just working with some folks internationally, and they're trying to use cinematic film essentially to make arguments. So they're moving away from print-based arguments about film and using film to make that arguments, which I think is a really interesting approach. It's not traditional. I mean, the departments these folks are coming from want the book. They want the book about the cinema. But what they're pushing up against is saying, no, we really want to use the medium in which we're working to talk about the medium in which we're working. And that seems to me to be a logical, argument.
Well, yeah, and I think just to flag something that, first of all, I think Ethan's point is really important, that of course, we're talking about various points of overlap and connection and different nexuses between different disciplinary stories about the history of information. And then I also just wanted to kind of flag something that Dina keeps bringing up, which is education and pedagogy, which I don't think we've really brought into the discussion yet. It may relate to what I think is maybe an upcoming question about digital humanities and ethics, but in case it's useful for people, this may be incomplete. I'm realizing that my sort of mental categories for the digital humanities tend to fall into the archive and archival work, teaching, research, and publishing, all conceived very broadly, and all with the understanding that you can have teaching about the archive and an archive of teaching and publications on research and vice versa. But, I think we've mentioned sort of the research and the archive aspects and a little bit about publishing and social media and political movements. The teaching is also, I think, absolutely central to certainly what Dini's describing into the digital humanities in general.
And you're right, Adam. I do think that this does lend itself to a question regarding where the conversation's been going regarding ethics, and I think sort of Ethan started down that road. He mentioned that this DH is transdisciplinary, and that people from different disciplines are going to come not with different ethical approaches, but with different approaches. Right. And so when you have people who are coming together, who are accustomed perhaps to doing things in particular ways that are different, I think it's important to have that conversation more so than when you're working within your own tribe, if you will. So does the humanities stand to provide the digital humanities with approaches and tools and practices? And where's the ethical dimension of that?
I mean, I'm happy to keep going if that's useful. I think I would start one place, of course, one of many places to start. So I'm drawing this from, I think it's Kathleen Kirkpatrick. I could be wrong about that. I have to look it up. Who makes the point that the digital humanities are not just about the inflection or the influence of digital tools on the humanities, but that the humanities can be speaking to the digital world and the world of digital tools and social media about ethical uses, or they can humanize kind of computing in some sense. But again, I would put teaching perhaps right at the center of that, along with the political movements that sometimes depend on digital media there. And I think this does tie into the somewhat more difficult question that's raised by the Chronicle article that we may or may not get to later, about the institutional context of the digital humanities, the way it's addressed, considered, fostered, funded by educational institutions, and the degree, what it does for students, really, I think is a pretty key question. What it does for students in kind of quote unquote traditional classrooms, and what it does in as far as altering the structure of education.
May I mention, I was really fortunate. I did my second master's and my PhD in humanities. It was not a literature program. It was not a history. It was humanities. And my professor that I studied with told me early on that to be good at what I was going to do, I need to focus on teaching and research, and that you can't just teach and not do research, and you can't do research without teaching. The ethical basis is that they go hand in hand, because without sharing your research with the next generation of people, you're being greedy with your knowledge. If you're not doing research, then you're not creating new knowledge, and so you're not participating in the conversation. You're simply passing what someone else has done on. And so we were encouraged to continue teaching and not and really think of that as an ethical basis. And I've been in the field now. I've been out of a graduate student since '95, so I've been teaching for over 20 plus years. And when someone asked me if I want a course release, my response is no. I really do want to impart this with my students, and I think there's value to that. And I don't think it's a good idea to not embrace these two hand in hand. So,
Ethan, was there anything you wanted to share on that?
Yes, I was just unmuting myself. I mean, my sort of, my ethical guidelines as someone who works in sort of digital spaces are the same ethical guidelines that guide me as an anthropologist. Right? I mean, they are no different at all. And the questions that emerge as an anthropologist and a sort of traditionally trained for subfield anthropologist who does archaeology are express themselves equally in my digital work. So I mean, looking to our disciplinary or domain-based ethical sort of frameworks, I think is particularly important. They're not done because at the end of the day, again, for me, it's talking from my perspective, my digital work is always in service of my disciplinary work. It's always to ask and answer questions that are relevant to my discipline and sort of my subdiscipline as well. So why shouldn't the ethical guidelines of that discipline guide my digital practice as well?
So I did a postdoc with a transdisciplinary program in the UK at University of Plymouth. And it was a lot of folks that were coming from the arts and dance and various areas. And we would sit together for 10 days straight, 8 hours a day, talking about our research. And I realized the trouble we were having was being able to use the same languaging and the same ethical base and the same kind of philosophical frameworks. And it was the only thing that brought us together was we all use computers for our work, and that wasn't enough. So as I left that program in 2004, I developed a series of what I call now 11 principles, guiding principles for my program that I oversee at the university. And my program brings in people who have different backgrounds. And so we sit around at a table and we have to converse and make policy and create courses for our students and figure out how we're going to do things. So these 11 guiding principles have come in handy for us. And every year we read them together and we recommit to them. We change them, we tweak them, we add to them. So what started off as 7 is now 11. And they change perhaps every couple of years, we'll add something to it. And they're all linked to something in some field of digital. So I have them here and I'll be glad to share them with everybody, but it sure makes it easier to work with people and have the same kind of structural foundation, you know, for the multiple fields that we're working in.
I actually think I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying common ground.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the greatest challenges that I found, working across this space is yes, we share computational approaches and sort of computational frameworks, but we're oftentimes stymied by that, the disciplinary speak, right? So I get into a room with a bunch of literary scholars, and 75% of the time, I haven't the faintest clue what they're talking about, right? Because the speech is so, and this is no different from any discipline, right? We have modes and methods of speeches that are unique to them. And I found that is by far the greatest challenge of this work is that hurdle of kind of embedded and deeply embedded disciplinary speech and practice.
And I think that brings us back to the earlier question too about change of methodology. I mean, that sort of this kind of sort of ties all of that together. And I kind of want to move in a similar direction. But before I do, I just want to remind our audience there is a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to go ahead and put some questions in there. Also, if you're in the Slack community, there have been some questions posted there already, which as we're approaching the 45-minute mark here, we're going to get a chance at the end to ask some of those questions. But before we do that, so we've talked here a little bit about the transdisciplinary nature of this, and now we've started talking about methods and methodology and research and approach and ethics coming from a variety of fields. And it brings to mind, and I'm going to post here into the chat, an article by one of our panelists. Ethan had written an article for the Digital Humanities debates called Archaeology, Digital Humanities in the Big Tent. And it's to some extent really what we're talking about at this point. I mean, this goes beyond just one discipline. The tent is big. And when we were having a conversation between us previous to this, I had said, who makes the rules about who gets to get into the tent and who holds the keys? And Adam was kind enough to remind me I was mixing my metaphors there, that tents don't have keys. So who holds the flaps to the tent, right? I mean, so is there a tent that someone controls, and who is that controls it? And if that's the case, what can be done to do what it is DH folks seem to want to do to begin with, and that is to collaborate together?
Well, doesn't the humanities at the very basis of what it is, it's already big. It's foreign language, it's literature, it's history, some anthropology, it's already big. I don't think it's that much different when we move it into the digital, right? I mean, the connector with the traditional humanities is the print book. The connector with DH is computation. But it's still a big tent no matter what side of the street you're living on, right? And most of us working in DH are human, are traditional humanities people too. We wear two hats because we have to. Our departments demand it.
I mean, the thing that, I mean, I can sort of take the blame for this article since I wrote it, that sort of drove me is I'm not a humanist. I'm a social scientist, right? You know, so what is the sort of the interesting role, and much of the article and sort of much of my discussion about this is my musings about my own sort of personal relationship to people who sort of consider themselves humanists and sort of this sort of role. But I mean, if we characterize this tent as a humanist tent, I'm sitting on the outside, right? You know, but I consider myself a participant in the digital humanities community. I mean, it's just, I mean, these are the sort of the interesting intricacies of this debate or
well, the anthropology
discussion.
department of my university has a combination of humanist and social studies people, but that department is in the College of Liberal Arts as a humanities-based program. So I think and history has the same conundrum, right? They have, you know, scientists and they have humanists, but it's in the humanities in our department. And so I think it's interesting to see how there's been this bleed over for quite some time. None of these folks are DH people. They're all traditional humanities people.
Yeah, and I just add, I agree with Jeannie that, you know, I've always sort of taken that to the DH, the limiting of it to digital humanities, to reflect, you know, on the one hand, just kind of shorthand, right? So like, I work in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. It's kind of bundled together. I mean, but also to reflect the kind of attempted sort of provocation where like to say, well, imagine the most sort of like flighty, non-scientific realm of the humanities and make that digital, but that's sort of the frisson of that has been kind of driving it, right? So to me, it's far less surprising that there might be digital applications in the social sciences. That sort of like makes much more intuitive sense. And going all the way, you know, down that road in that direction, the hard sciences, I mean, are the hard sciences excluded from sort of like what we think of as the digital humanities tent? I think certainly not, in as much as they have a kind of humanist element, which they all do. It's just that it's much less surprising to say that there's a digital element in particle physics, right? The one other thing I'd add on the question of the tent and the previous question of ethics is, I do think that the institutional framework and the administrative framework here is both a little bit uncomfortable to think about, but also pretty crucial to think about. You know, so who holds the metaphorical keys to the metaphorical tent? You know, it's not necessarily people working in the disciplines primarily. There are deep institutional investments that have changed radically over the past 10 years that are sometimes also corporate investments too. So if we're thinking about who holds the keys, not to get too conspiratorial, but that's a dimension that we don't often talk about, but you know, does come up or should come up.
And this is very interesting to me because so we're talking about being steeped in the traditional sciences, right? So computer science, I mean, I know it's not biology or chemistry, but computer science, I think counts as a traditional science, and that's the department from which this was born. So here we are 40, 50 years later talking about how to try and justify the people who started the whole thing being involved. But I think what it really brings up, and I'd like to give you guys a chance also to talk about this, is are we talking about being a humanist with a capital H or with a lowercase h, right? Because I think Ethan, right, is a humanist with a lowercase h, because I think his research question touches on the humanistic experience. Right, so he may not be a humanist as in he's in the humanities, a specific humanities discipline, but I mean, and this came up in a conversation recently here during one of our digital humanities days. You know, I think if your research question has a humanistic aspect to it, then at least for that research, you're a humanist with a little h. So I'll just sort of drop that out there.
I mean, you can call me anything you want, and I'll accept it, you know, graciously. But I mean. At the end of the day, for me, I actually, even though these questions and these discussions occupy an enormous sort of footprint of this space, I actually think that they're somewhat distracting. And you know, I mean, there are many people that would sort of disagree with me. I think that it's far better to do good, meaningful work that's digitally inflected, that asks and answers questions, than to discuss or ask whether you're in that tent or outside of that tent. At the end of the day, and I'm being somewhat flippant here, does it really matter? Is your work valuable and valued? That should be the metric, not so much sort of where you sit in this imaginary space of individuals.
I think I start always with a research question, right? And the one that we were given as graduate students in this humanities program at University of Texas at Dallas back in 1990 was, what does it mean to be human? That was a question that we were seeking to answer as humanists studying the humanities. And I've been thinking about that for a long time as I was moving towards using more and more, digital and computational work. The question for me changed to, what does it mean to be a human at a time when so much of what we do is mediated by and expressed through digital technologies? That to me seemed to be a crucial shift in what I was doing, and made a lot of sense about, what kind of humanist I was. It didn't mean I wasn't interested in the human condition, but certainly my focus on the human condition is really looking at how we're affected by these technologies, everything from Twitter to old hypertext to, Flash before, today AR. I'm working a lot in AR and VR. I'm interested in the human and how we experience these things and make sense of the world around us and express ourselves. So I'll leave that there.
So we are closing in on the last few minutes. Ethan, did you want to add something to that? I don't know if did I just cut you off again? I'm sorry.
No.
So we're getting sort of towards the end here, and we have some really good questions I would like to get to. So the first one, which was posted in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, folks, so please feel free to post your questions there. Also, if you're in the Slack channel, if you're not, everybody who was invited who signed up for today's event should have received an invitation. If you didn't, I'll put my email address into the chat. Please write to me. We'll make sure you get into the channel so that you can continue the conversation after today's event is over. And any questions that are posted there, I'm going to try and make sure that we get answered. But Dwight asks, he says, I'm a curator for 3D art that exists only in digital form. I create exhibition catalogs in traditional print format, but flat photos can't capture the nonlinear interactive nature of the work. Can you guys talk a bit more about long-term preservation of ephemeral digital assets?
Thank you for that question. That's been my dilemma for the past 20 years. So yes, there's 3 ways to do this. There's emulation, migration, and the third one's collection, documentation. And so I actually gravitate towards a third one. And you might have missed it, but earlier I mentioned I have a lab of 60 vintage computers dating back to 77. And I work just in participatory, interactive, and experiential media that I call electronic literature, or we call electronic literature. And so what we've been doing is documenting this work on these original computing platforms and putting them into scalar books. And so we're doing video documentation, ekphrastic kind of writing around it. And now I'm using Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to bring in more participatory experiences with these texts. But we have people actually experiencing this work live, and then we captured that experience on video so that it's preserved through time and documented. I'm happy to share the platform with you and all the stuff we're doing if you're interested. But there is a methodology, it's called Pathfinders, and we were given an NEH grant to develop this. I'm happy to share.
That's excellent, thank you.
I mean, this is the digital library community has been engaging with these issues for 30, 40 years, right? And we're particularly interested in my work personally. The work of my center is about digital preservation, and in every time we ask that question or ask, the issue of digital preservation comes up, we look to the digital library community. Because they will already have asked, potentially answered that question.
I disagree with that. I'm actually doing the certification in digital archiving through the SAA. And I've been sitting through these courses, and it's been amazing to me, and and having these conversations with my teachers. They're talking about the electronic record as being a flat object, like an email or some sort of Word doc. And when I ask them about what they're doing for interactive works, they're not addressing that in this archival process. Secondly, I'm trying to find even archival material to put 3.5 inch floppies and 5.25 inch floppies in. When I call the archival companies, there's not even things to put the stuff in, and the answer I get from them is, oh, people don't collect that stuff anymore. And I'm now getting things on flash drives, and I'm looking for archival material to put that in, and there's nothing for that. So I think there's a disjunct between what's happening with electronic records, and long been discussed, and this kind of, I mean, what do you do with AR? And they're not quite addressing that stuff so readily, and there's not even the equipment we need to hold on to these physical objects that go with them. So it's been a real problem, and I've been working to solve this with electronic literature, especially for the past 20 years.
Adam, I don't know if you got a chance to chime in there and if you wanted to, or should I go on to the next question?
It's so clearly a question suited especially to Dini and also to Ethan that I'm not going to add anything.
Not a problem. So from our Slack channel, Bobby has asked, what strategies and or tools have you found most useful in delivering, sharing DH pedagogy?
A lot of what I've been working on, some of what I've been working on is, I guess what I call translation of existing digital tools and archives into usable form in the classroom. So again, to take the Folger anthology, the digital anthology of early modern drama, what we ended up doing with that in particular, I mean, the question is sort of like, yes, you could run a unit that lasts for 3 months that makes use of some of the textual tools that have been done. They're more immediately, obviously suited for professional research, but how do you bring them into the classroom? In that particular case, we ended up relying on the metadata attached to each of those texts. And with various visualization tools, those can be used to reconstruct, in this case, a kind of social network of early English theater between playwrights, printers, publishers, actors, and so there's all kinds of geo mapping that you can do with that. But in that particular case, we presented with far too much digital information in this particular tool. We looked around the very, very outside of the sphere and picked a few pieces of incredibly useful and incredibly compelling information to use. So that's just a bit of a meta example in the sense that it's not the specific tool that I'm recommending, but it might be an approach. I think more often than not, a key pedagogical question within the digital humanities is, what do you do with too much information?
Mm-hmm.
For me, and not entirely sure if this addresses the question. I mean, I teach digital methods. I teach as sort of standalone. I teach them within the context of sort of traditional disciplinary topics. When I'm teaching a class in Egyptian archaeology, it's always digitally inflected, for instance. I don't teach tools that, I mean, it's counterproductive because it sort of can change day to day. The things that I do is open source, open data. Always use tools that are open source. Always leverage open data. Produce and consume both open data, and also in the context of sort of pedagogical settings, build real things. Having students actually build things and actually build real things that other people can engage with, as opposed to building things that are purely learning based. Right? I'm going to build this thing to learn these skills. No, you build this thing to learn the skills and to build the thing. As well, and then see how people will engage with it.
So the next question, again from Bobby, what advice do you have for faculty that want to engage with DH content in coursework? What do you recommend as a jumping off point to get started?
Does he mean by developing material for syllabus and for teaching the course? Is that what he means?
I'm not either. Yes, she just said yes.
So I have a book with me that I highly recommend. It's called Digital Humanities. This book, when it came out several years ago, I bought 10 copies and passed them out to all of my administrators. And because it does a nice job consolidating a lot of the discussions about DH and history and what might be considered DH projects. And we're a project-based program on my campus, and it was an argument for people to accept us to be considered serious with our students making projects instead of taking, tests and that kind of thing. So this book came in handy. I also am a curator, so I was trying to make, full professor on my curation. So this book came in real handy for me. So I recommend that one. And then there's a series that Ray Siemens does called Doing Digital Humanities. I recommend that one too. And there's a whole slew of other books, but those, and then also the debates in digital humanities, the 3 books I would recommend.
I just dropped a plug here in for synchronous online teaching, which to go all the way back to the beginning of the discussion and Ethan's point about access can be kind of transformative. So I think still we very often automatically think of asynchronous pedagogy when we talk about online teaching, online classes. It doesn't have to be that way, especially these days with kind of, improvements in the tools and changes in the flow of information, the rate of information. Teaching classes remotely live can be something that's fairly useful in terms of access.
I mean, I think that these are all great, really great examples, and there have been some interesting NEH-funded advanced institutes that have produced learning materials that can be used as models for sort of deployment in classrooms. I think that might be a really good place to look. But also the community is it's a very giving community, and engaging with the community either online and simply asking for models and examples. How do you guys teach this stuff, or what do you do with this, or can I see your syllabus? I mean, literally every syllabus for all of my classes and all of my learning material is online and openly accessible. So going to the community and leveraging in the best possible way the community's generosity to get a perspective on that from a variety of different sort of disciplines is a really good strategy.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and I know at some point Alex is going to pop back in here and cut us off. So I'm going to ask you guys to give a 30-second answer to this. Matthew Silence mentions in the Slack channel a great point made during the webinar about making arguments using a variety of media, not just text. Is this a form of curation of digital media? Should the practice or practices of DH involve curation?
Well, yes, curation, yes. As a matter of fact, it is considered one of the major activities in the Digital Humanities book that I was glad to see. So curation can be everything from doing gallery shows to curating your work for an argument. So yes, absolutely.
I'm not sure how metaphorical curation is in the question. If it's purely metaphorical and it just means choosing different things, definitely, yeah, that's pretty important, I'd say, especially if there are things in different media.
Yeah, I mean, in the broadest sense, of course, right? I would, of course, sort of caution the use of that word in the same way that I would caution the use of the word archiving, where it's been sort of overused, but it has a very, very sort of strict professional disciplinary definition. So as all of my curatorial friends tell me, and archivist friends, they get rather frustrated when they're used sort of colloquially.
Well, and I think that's a great place for us to end this conversation for today, because I think there are questions that came up out of the questions, and I'm really excited about continuing this conversation. And I want to really thank Ethan and Adam and Dina for making this. I got a lot out of this. I'm hoping those who are watching now and who watch this later also got a lot out of it. I just want to remind everybody that you will get a link to the recording for this. Please feel free to share that. Also, questions and answers, the ones that are in the Slack channel, we're going to continue the conversation there. So thank you, everybody. And I guess I will turn it over to someone from NMC at this point.
All right, to wrap up today's program, I want to thank AJ, our moderator, and our panelists on behalf of the NMC for taking time to lead to today's discussion. Really some good stuff out of there, getting some good ideas of where digital humanities is coming from, where it is today, and where it's headed. Participants, if you're not an NMC member, consider becoming one today. We're going to drop in another link for you to enjoy our programs coming up in 2018. which we're working on our schedule right now, and we want to make sure that you can be part of that. And for this year, we have one more program before the end of the year. Save the date for our next NMC Beyond the Horizon on December 6th, where William Tierney from USC will lead a discussion on sustaining innovation through leadership changes. And you can see that is going to be offered complimentary as well. So thank you all today for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for including me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.